welcome to chapter 13, which is one of my favorite chapters in the book because it covers the Federal Reserve, which is a really interesting system that we have in the United States. The Federal Reserve is something I'm sure you've heard about, something that we have mentioned in passing in this class a few times. And the problem with teaching the Federal Reserve is if I taught it at the beginning of the semester, there would be a lot of stuff you don't understand, and so I put it at the end. But then there's so much I wish I could talk about, several classes ago about the Federal Reserve, but you didn't know how it worked yet. So I usually hold off and teach this at the end because you have the depth of understanding at this point, hopefully, to comprehend what's going on, because it relates a lot of issues we've discussed in the past, such as the market for loanable funds, the role of banks, the role of money, and these sorts of things that we've covered in recent chapters. The Federal Reserve is a private, this is a surprising feature of the Federal Reserve, it's a private organization, meaning it is not part of the government, that handles major tasks regarding the monetary system and banks. Hard to define, but that's a decent explanation of what the Federal Reserve basically does. If you wanted to say everything the Federal Reserve does, that would probably take a year basically to describe and discuss. The Federal Reserve is a huge organization, and again, they're private, which means they operate completely separate from the government, which is really an amazing thing. That's important because it means the Federal Reserve has an incredible amount of autonomy. It can do whatever it wants because it really doesn't have to answer to the government. It doesn't have to have issues voted upon. It does whatever it wants to do. So it is really the only organization in the United States that's like that has its own ability to make its own rules and laws without any sort of democratic process. So let's jump into some of the things the Federal Reserve does, because I want you to understand from the get-go what sort of system we're talking about here. And so I want to discuss the functions of the Fed. And this is discussed in the book, and so that's certainly a good way to instill these lessons in your head if you want to go back and read the chapter here. But I'm just going to cover them quickly. Some of these are more important than others, and certainly this first one has got to be the most important. Controlling the money supply. This is an incredibly important aspect of the Federal Reserve, and it's certainly what the Federal Reserve is most well known for. Controlling the money supply is going to have major implications on basically every market in an economy, because this is going to affect inflation rates, which we know inflation rates are very important. We know that changes in inflation can cause changes in the economy. We know that deflation is not something we want. We know hyperinflation is not something we want. So that's one thing, is to avoid deflation, hyperinflation that the Fed is going to do. But also inflation affects markets a lot. If we have high inflation, that affects people's preferences to engage in activities today. For example, if I'm borrowing money, inflation rates are going to help determine how much I really have to pay back. In other words, if I borrow $100,000 today, if inflation is really high, what that means is when I pay my money back, I'm not having to pay as much real value back in the future. So inflation rates are going to affect the profitability and the plausibility of deals when you're thinking about time spans. So this affects inflation. It also affects interest rates. We know that interest rates are very important in the loanable funds market. So this is huge. Changing the money supply, adjusting the money supply is very important towards a successful economy. And vaguely, we refer to this act of adjusting the money supply as monetary policy, which is something we're going to get into more in this chapter. There's fiscal policy, which is adjusting government spending and tax rates to try to drive the economy. And then there's monetary policy, Monetary policy is the altering of the money supply, and correlated to that, interest rates, inflation rates, in order to achieve macroeconomic goals. So much like our government engages in fiscal policy, the Fed is engaged in monetary policy. And there are some pretty important benefits of monetary policy over fiscal policy. One is that monetary policy is a lot cheaper. Monetary policy doesn't require necessarily any borrowing or changing in tax rates or anything like that. So it can be a lot cheaper and easier to implement. So we'll talk more about monetary policy later in this chapter. So certainly that's the biggest one. Second thing that the Fed does is it supplies the economy with paper money. Number one and number two sound similar, but they're not. They're not the same. Supplying the economy with paper money literally means providing paper money. And most paper money that gets produced is produced to replace destroyed paper money. So if you've ever had like a dollar bill that has a rip in it or something like that, maybe you spent it, maybe you took it to the bank. But the bottom line is that type of money filters into the banks. The banks build it all up. They basically collect it all, and they send it to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve destroys it and replaces it with new dollar bills. The lifespan of a dollar bill is really short. It's only a couple of years. So they're constantly replacing paper money that's out there in society. When you think about that, that's a really big job because there's a lot of money that it needs to replace, and also they need to worry about counterfeiting. So they've got to figure out measures to avoid counterfeiting. So, you know, if you've ever looked at a $20 bill and hold it up to the light, you can see the sort of the lines and stuff that they have in there that are very hard to duplicate. So supplying the economy with paper money is a big job. Another thing they do is they hold banks' reserves. So, for example, you know, if you think about just about any large bank, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, BB&T, whatever, if you think about any of these banks have accounts at the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve will actually hold the money for these banks. And when I say hold the money, that's a bit of a misnomer because the money oftentimes doesn't really exist. It only digitally exists, meaning think about the money you have in a checking account right now. That money actually doesn't exist in a way. It's been loaned out, so the money in a checking account is just digital currency. Well, the Federal Reserve holds banks' digital currency in the same fashion. They do this because the banks like this because when the Fed is holding the money, it's keeping it safe. And it also allows them to do number 4. The Fed provides check clearing services for the banks. What does that mean? They provide check clearing services for the bank. What that basically means is the Fed operates as a bank for the banks. So for example, if Wells Fargo and Regions Bank, let's say Wells Fargo owes $1 million to Regions Banks, that's actually going to be handled by the Federal Reserve most likely. So the Federal Reserve has got these reserves that they're holding for both of these banks, and so the Federal Reserve will actually initiate these transactions between banks. This is important because banks owe each other a lot of money. If you think about maybe where your paycheck comes in, it's probably paid by some bank, and then you go deposit it into a different bank. So now one bank owes the other bank money. And there are, thousands of these transactions going back and forth every single day. And so the Federal Reserve a lot of times will take all these transactions, do some math, and figure out who owes who what. And so then the banks will actually pay the money through the Federal Reserve. This is just like a bank does for you, right? If you use your debit card and you make a purchase, the bank basically settles that problem for you. It settles the fact that you owe somebody some money. The Fed handles that for the banks at a very grand scale at the macro level. So this is another important job, and it helps banks be more smoothly run and more profitable. And the banks are actually required to do this, and they want to do it because they get a lot of benefits from the Federal Reserve. So, for example, banks may sometimes want to borrow from the Fed, so they want to have an account with the Fed. The Fed also sometimes will provide interest to the banks if they hold money there. So they give incentives for the banks to keep their money there, and that allows them to do these check clearing services. It also allows the Fed to keep an eye on these banks, because one thing that they do is supervise the banks. And they don't supervise all banks. Really small local banks often don't have accounts with the Federal Reserve, but if you're big enough, you're required to have an account with the Federal Reserve. Furthermore, they give them these incentives, right? Like holding their reserves, giving them interest, and then providing these check clearing services. One benefit of this is it allows the Feds to more easily supervise the banks. The Fed wants to keep an eye on the banks and make sure they're following the rules and regulations set forth by the federal government and also by the Federal Reserve. One of these rules we discussed before is that banks have to hold at least 10% of their deposits in their reserves. Since the banks have basically the paperwork from these individual banks on their file, the Fed can keep an eye on the banks. If they feel like the banks are breaking rules, they can punish them. And since they're a private organization, they can punish them without asking the government for permission. So the Fed has the ability to do something no other organization in the U.S. can do. And that's basically punish companies for not following rules, even though the Federal Reserve itself is not part of the government. It's very different from other organizations. Okay? So that's 5 things they can do. We've got 3 more, so let me erase these. 3 more that I want to talk about. One of these is that the Fed serves as the federal government's bank. Much like you have a bank account, the federal government has a bank account, and their bank account is at the Fed. So if the government needs to access some money, it contacts the Fed, and it can access it that way. Okay? So anything that you might do with a bank account, or anything that a business might do with a bank account, the government does with the Fed. Okay? But it's a lot more than what you or I probably do. Okay? They'll handle regular day-to-day operations, but they also help the government borrow money. And how much money has the government borrowed historically? Well, a lot. Right now, our federal government is more than $20 trillion in debt, and that comes from borrowing. And the way they borrow money is they call up the Federal Reserve and say, "Yo, Fed, can you help us borrow some money?" And the Fed is the one that actually engages in these policies. So the Fed doesn't decide how much money the government is going to borrow. It simply facilitates the government borrowing. Okay? So another thing the Fed does is it facilitates government borrowing at the federal level. And it does this, generally speaking, through Treasury securities. And these are government bonds that are sold to raise government funds. Okay, these are called Treasury securities, or generically referred to sometimes as government bonds. The way this works is the government calls up the Fed and says, we need to raise $1 billion. We need to borrow $1 billion. And the Fed will actually create these governmental bonds and provide them for sale on the free market. So right now, you or I could go down to the bank and buy some Treasury securities, okay? So the Federal Reserve is actually the one handling these transactions and making it actually occur, okay? So again, they're not choosing how much the government should borrow, they're simply facilitating it. But this is a really big job because the government borrows, I guess this year they'll borrow, hundreds of billions of dollars. So this is a really big job. Not only can they borrow these funds this way, but they can also go the other direction. If they want to pay off some debt, they can actually reverse these transactions. That's something we're going to talk about later in this chapter. And then the last one I'm going to put up here is the Fed serves as a lender of last resort. Fed serves as a lender of last resort. And if the Fed is loaning money, they can loan money to banks. They don't ever loan that I know of, to individuals, meaning I couldn't get a loan from the Federal Reserve directly, but a bank could. If a bank needs funds, it can borrow from the Fed. Typically, we think of this as the lender of last resort because most of the time, these are high interest rates. So meaning the banks can borrow from the Fed. Banks can borrow from the Fed really whenever they want, but they're just disincentivized to do so because the interest rates tend to be pretty high. So a bank may easily be able to borrow money from another bank at 2% interest, and the Fed may be charging 5% interest. So the bank is only going to borrow from the Fed if it's desperate, if it needs money right now and it can't find any. Therefore, it is really the lender of last resort. If a bank can't find any money now, it can contact the Fed and borrow some money that way. Okay? So that's some of the stuff that the Fed does. The Fed is a huge organization. This is not all they do. They provide massive educational services in terms of learning about economics and the government. They have museums that you can go visit, and those are run by their employees. I mean, there's just so much they do. It's really hard to even list them all. But the bottom line is it's a huge organization with a lot of responsibility. And remember, they're private. So they can do a lot because they're private. They don't have to answer to the government. But they're given special abilities to reward or punish businesses that are not doing things correctly. So they act like the government in terms of their ability to, use the fist if they need to. But it's amazing that they're not part of the government because that allows them to really do whatever they want. They don't have to set new laws up or go through Congress. They can just change things whenever they feel like changing it. It gives them a lot of power. All right, so now let's talk about the structure of the Fed and how it's set up. Briefly here. All right, so we'll talk about the structure, and I'm going to just give you a couple of notes regarding the Fed's history as well. The Fed was begun in 1913. And the goal was to stop bank runs. And we need to find that term there, bank runs. The whole reason the Fed was started in 1913 was to stop bank runs. And a bank run is when everyone withdraws their money simultaneously from a bank. And really, to imagine this most dramatically, just imagine if literally everyone went to the bank to withdraw their money simultaneously. Why would that be a problem if everybody tried to get their money out of the bank at the same time? The problem is the bank doesn't really have that much money, right? The bank is only required to hold at least 10% of its reserves. So if everybody tries to withdraw their money simultaneously, the bank is literally going to run out of money. This used to happen all the time in the early 1900s, and it continued happening throughout the Great Depression. And the Fed was tasked in 1913 with stopping these bank runs. They weren't successful for a while. They did slow the extent of bank runs, but they continued through the 30s and 40s. And even today, occasionally we'll have something that looks like a bank run, but nothing's super dramatic. We have a lot more rules in place that make it hard for bank runs to happen. Eventually, though, people do trust the Federal Reserve, and these bank runs are very, very rare today. But they could happen at any point. As long as there are people who don't believe the banks have money, or if they're worried that the banks are going to run out of money, that can start a panic. People try to withdraw their money simultaneously. So that was the initial job of the Fed. The reason why the Fed wasn't super successful in stopping bank runs initially is, one, because we were really not all that good at understanding how bank runs worked and how to stop them, and two, the Fed didn't have a lot of power. The Fed's power has grown tremendously in the last few decades, and in 1913 when it was created, they really couldn't do a whole lot. All right, they didn't have the autonomous ability to make their own rules like they have today. So that's a little bit of history, just to explain sort of where this came from and why it was created. Of course, today they do a lot more than that, right? They change the money supply, they serve as the government's bank, et cetera, et cetera. At the top of the Fed, we have the Board of Governors. And this is the decision makers. Board of Governors. And on this board, there are a max of 7 members. Okay? And these Board of the Governors are the ones that are going to make the big decisions. Okay? If the government calls up the Fed and says, hey, Fed, we need to borrow $15 billion, Board of Governors is not going to do anything with that. That's going to be handled by people at the lower level, right? That's simply just making the math happen, figuring out a way to borrow the money. What the Board of Governors do is decide things like, what should our inflation rate be this year? What do we want to target? What do we want to happen with interest rates? The really big macroeconomic decisions that need to be made are made by the Board of Governors. And as you might expect, the Board of Governors is filled with extremely talented economists who have generally a lot of experience working in macroeconomic fields. So this has as many as 7 members at any given time. These people, you might wonder, how do we decide who's going to be on the Board of Governors? It's kind of interesting. These people are chosen by the U.S. president, which is strange because, as I mentioned before, the Fed is private, meaning the Fed doesn't have to go through the government when making choices. However, the Fed unquestionably has some ties to the federal government, and this is one of these. The decision-making group of the Fed is decided by the U.S. presidents. However, when the Fed was created, the concern was that a U.S. president could have too much control of the Fed and basically have the Fed in his or her pocket. To avoid that happening, the terms were set up in a way so that one U.S. president couldn't completely control the Fed. Specifically, these individuals serve 14-year terms, okay? They serve 14-year terms. So what that means is Donald Trump couldn't possibly have all of the members of the Fed be the ones that he had selected because they serve 14-year terms, so there are members from the Fed that were chosen, a decade, 12 years ago right now that are in the Fed today, okay? This is staggered in that there's a new selection every 2 years. So in 2018, right, if you can imagine there's somebody who was elected in 2004, they will be on the Fed until 2018, okay? And then we'll get a new election here, and that will go all the way to 2022. Meanwhile, one of those other members was selected in 2006. They'll go all the way to 2020, and then all the way to 2024, okay? So there are 7 iterations of this, right? There's one in 2004, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 7 of those at any given point, okay? And again, the whole reason here that you would want to do this is because, there are 2 members here that are selected by Donald Trump, but there is going to be other members, like the one appointed in 2008, that will still be on the Fed during Donald Trump's presidency. So there's no way that Donald Trump could control the entirety of the Fed, okay? That was the basic idea of having it set up this way. The logic was we don't want these people to be basically just members of the president's cabinet. We want them to be independent thinkers that don't have to answer to the government. The other benefit is if you serve 14-year terms, you tend to be a little bit more oriented towards the long term. Meaning, if the Board of Governors were only there for 6 months, they'd be trying to do policies that are oriented towards the 6-month period. But since they know they're going to be in the Fed for a really long time, they're more likely to worry about the future, okay? They're also less likely to worry about ruffling some feathers. If I was elected in 2004 and I do something that politicians hate, well, I know I'm going to be there until 2018. So if I piss some people off, well, there's not much they can do about it. I'm still going to be around for 14 years, so I'm not going to have to worry about, politicians ruining my life after I leave because I've got 14 years in my term. So I can do whatever I feel like is right. That's at least the logic behind setting it up this way. Okay? So that's the Board of Governors. And at the top, there's the chair. All right? The chair of the Board of Governors is the most important person in the Fed. They're kind of like the U.S. president of the Fed. They're the person at the very top. And the chair of the Board of Governors currently, right now, is somebody called Jerome Powell, who you probably haven't ever heard of. He's only been in this position at the time of me speaking this, began in 2018, so it hasn't been very long. Prior to him, it was Janet Yellen. You may have heard of her. And then prior to that, it was Ben Bernanke, and then Alan Greenspan. Janet Yellen and Jerome Powell, you haven't heard much from them because the economy's been good. And when the economy is good, people don't really worry about the Fed that much. But when the economy is bad, it is on the news constantly. So Ben Bernanke, he was the chair of the Fed. He was put in place, I believe, in 2008. So right when that Great Recession was beginning, and he was on the news constantly. Anytime he had a briefing or something, it was filmed. It'd be on multiple channels because everybody wanted to know what the Fed was going to do. So when the Fed is bad, or when the economy is bad, everybody looks at the Fed because they have the ability to change interest rates and inflation rates. When the economy is really good, it's like a lot of things, you stop paying attention to it, right? You know, I don't really think about my ankle until it starts hurting. That's kind of how it is with the Fed. When the economy's bad, everybody turns their eyes to the Fed. So the Board of Governors is at the top. And now let's think about it, breaking it out throughout the entire U.S. The Fed is chaired in Washington, D.C. That's where the headquarters are. But it has branches throughout the United States. And the Fed is broken into 14 districts that are somewhat evenly distributed throughout the country. Okay? And each of these districts has a headquarters. So, for example, out west, the Pacific Midwest, or I'm sorry, the Pacific West, the headquarters there is in San Francisco, and it's got actually a really big region around it. There's a region up in the Northeast. New York City is the chair of that one. Let's see, St. Louis is another one. Denver is another. For us, it's Atlanta. Okay, so we belong to that branch. So in Atlanta, they have a huge Federal Reserve building, tons of employees. I've been there a few times, actually. They have a museum. It's free to visit. You can go check that out. And at the Atlanta district, they make decisions for the district. And they also report back to the headquarters. The logic basically is that every district is maybe having its own issues. Prices could be going up dramatically in the Northeast while they could be going down in the Southeast. So monetary policy doesn't necessarily affect all areas of the country equally. Maybe interest rates aren't adjusting or calibrating correctly throughout the entire U.S. So the logic here is we need eyes throughout the country. And so the Atlanta headquarters is for our district, and they're going to keep an eye on our district and make sure things are running smoothly. Okay? This way the Fed has the ability to look at the entire United States simultaneously. That's the logic of that. Okay? 14 districts, by the way, doesn't have anything to do with what I'm about to speak with now, because this can be a bit confusing. And actually, I made a mistake here. 12 districts, okay? 12 districts. So there are 12 districts, and where I see students get confused is this next part, because there are also 12 members of the Federal Open Market Committee. Federal Open Market Committee. So the reason I point this out is you see 12 here, you see 12 here. It's really just a coincidence. These aren't set up to be correlated with each other. All right, the Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee. What they do is they handle the sale and purchase of Treasury securities. Okay, when I say handle, it's not really the best way to explain that. They don't literally handle these transactions. Rather, they help decide how these transactions are going to be done and where they're going to be done. So, for example, imagine if the government decided, we need to borrow $100 billion. They call up the Fed and they say, Fed, we need $100 billion. And the Fed goes to New York City and New York City only to borrow that money. Well, that is going to have huge impacts on New York City's market, right? And it's also going to affect the other markets that don't get a chance to borrow that money, or rather to loan that money to the federal government. So we need somebody to decide, where is the money going to go? If the U.S. needs to borrow money, where are we going to get that money? And if we decide to go the other direction, which is another possibility, what if the government doesn't want to borrow money, but it wants to reverse some of that debt? Again, we need somebody to decide how this is going to be done. So the Federal Open Market Committee decides this, okay? The Federal Open Market Committee is made up of 7 members of the board, the 7 governors, right? So that's Jerome Powell and the other 6 members, in addition to 5 of the district headquarter presidents. All right, 5 of the district headquarters presidents. And there are 12, there are 12 districts up here that we discussed. So there's only 5 that are going to be in this at any given time. And the way this works is they rotate out on just a regular rotating basis. With the exception of the New York headquarters president is always there. The logic here is the New York Fed chair, right? Of these 12 districts, one of those is headquartered in New York City. The logic is New York City is the home of Wall Street, right? It's the home of the New York Stock Exchange. It's the financial center of the world. So the person in the New York Stock Exchange probably needs constant consideration, right? The person here in New York is just so important that we always need to hear from this person. So the Federal Open Market Committee is going to include the 7 governors, plus always the New York Fed chair. And then the other 4 of these district presidents are going to rotate through on just a regular basis, okay? So these are the people to decide how the government is going to borrow money when it decides it wants to. Where that money is going to come from, it's a really big choice because we know that there can be problems like indirect crowding out. So we're trying to avoid those sorts of problems. All right, so I will stop there. What we have covered so far is the basics of what the Fed does and the basics of the structure of the Fed. I would certainly recommend reading this chapter. It's one of the hardest chapters in the class, and what we're going to start doing in the next chapter is really challenging, but it's also really interesting. It's fun to see what the Fed does and how they do it because it's really amazing how this process works. So I'll stop here.